Welcome to Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. Today we're going to be looking at Vulcan's Hammer by Philip K. Dick. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Stefan D. Iorio. You should check out his channel if you haven't already, and that's youtube.com/smudboy, S-M-U-D-B-O-Y. And Philip K. Dick is one of the leading legendary luminaries of the science fiction pantheon. He ranks high among the likes of Isaac Asimov and William Gibson as one for whom we can definitively say that were it not for him, the genre would not exist as we know it today. And that is not a statement to be made lightly. He was the winner of the Hugo Award and the John W. Campbell Award, among many other accolades in his life. He is also proclaimed as the most adapted science fiction writer in history, with many of his books and short stories being turned into movies and TV programs and the like. And that legacy has included such blockbusters as Blade Runner, Total Recall, and Minority Report, and many, many others. So with that in mind, we decided to take a look at Vulcan's Hammer, which is a lesser-known work and not one that is usually discussed in conversations about Philip K. Dick. His more prominent works would include Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the basis for Blade Runner, and Scanner Darkly, which is my personal favorite of his works. And so, with that in mind, Vulcan's Hammer presents an interesting take on the world run by machines concept. It is set in a future world after a major worldwide apocalyptic fallout of some sort, where society has been completely restored and is healthy, functioning and very healthy, but it is done so at the cost of creating a one-world government that is overseen by a mysterious supercomputer, Vulcan 3. And so the story takes us into the world of the upper-level officials in the Unity organization, which is the organization in charge of relaying and receiving information from Vulcan 3 and making sure its orders are carried out. And so there's a tremendous amount of paranoia and subversion, which was very, very popular and very common in Philip K. Dick's writing. And with the man himself, he was clinically schizophrenic and suffered from a number of mental handicaps in that regard. But he was able to channel that his mental disorders into some of the most fascinating science fiction that's ever been written. So, Stefan, what was your impression of this book?
Well, there's several things I could say about this book. When I first read it, I thought this was kind of bad. I saw some grammar mistakes. The pacing was all over the place. The characters were all over the place. And then you step back and go, wait a second, this pacing is extremely quick. I've never read a dystopian future, and some people don't even consider it a dystopian future story. And yet it's just flows so quickly. So it's like a novella, but again, it's not described as a novella. It's like a novel. So, in terms of Philip K. Dick's work, this is kind of like the bottom of the barrel, but it's still that good for Philip K. Dick. And you said paranoia about him being a person. That is pretty much the theme of every single character in this story. They are paranoid about what's going on, about other people, what they're going to do. So when the idea of artificial intelligence is introduced into the story, it really brings that a bit higher, because this is a post-World War III environment. I don't know if it's post-apocalyptic, but it was enough for the world leaders to come together and say, humanity sucks. We got to figure ourselves out now. We're going to put our hands in a computer. And by that, they mean like a punch card reader computer where you give it a question and it'll answer it with a very objective, clear thought, best response. So they kept doing this until a world government was formed around these machines, and they organized like the cardinals of Catholicism, these 12 sort of guys that orchestrate all the police states around the world. And by police state, we're not talking like 1984 police state, but it's sort of like a version of that, just watered down. We're thinking more like a setting of Brave New World, but again, not like that, just watered down. So it's like a very watered down sort of, this could actually happen in the future. And then it's with the genre of action. So you have this action story, which could sit very well within a made-for-TV movie on the Space Channel, maybe a miniseries, and it would work. So this is the kind of feeling you get. It's that when you read this story, I think.
Absolutely. And one of the things that kept resonating with me, you said it perfectly, and I came to that feeling as well, was that there is a strong religious metaphor here, and Catholicism is directly relevant to that, because I kept thinking about the character of Jason Dill, who in the story, Jason Dill is the supreme director of the Unity Project, and therefore he is the person who communicates with Vulcan 3 directly, and it is his responsibility to relay information to Vulcan 3 and to relay information from Vulcan 3 to the world at large. And that was interesting to me because, without giving too much away, one of the critical turning points in the novel is when it's revealed that Jason Dill is controlling what information Vulcan 3 gets and controlling what information comes out from Vulcan 3. So with that in mind, it made me sort of start to think of the Pope, who is supposed to be the one single voice speaking for God, the one directly in communication with God, and what that means. And that's actually that, we kind of, obviously I am an atheist, so I don't put any stock in the Pope being able to literally speak to God, but we've often, as a culture, entertained the idea that, well, if one person's speaking to God, then that person, or is speaking on God's behalf, then that person is more in control than God. And Philip K. Dick kind of turns that around here, where he's not only controlling what this person says on behalf of God, he's controlling what is said to God. And that's something that Philip K. Dick has done in other stories. He's got one short story, the name is escaping me right now, where there is an alien race who has a Christ figure like our own, but rather than us drinking the blood and eating the body of the Savior drinks our blood and eats our body. And so that is very much an ongoing theme in Philip K. Dick's writing, and Dick was a deeply spiritual man, very much fascinated by the Christian Gnostic ideas and that sort of thing. And so those religious themes do factor into his work, and so that was a very strong metaphor for me, and I thought it was interesting as it develops throughout the story. We learn that Vulcan 3 is not the only Vulcan as suggested by the 3 in its name, and that the previous incarnation of Vulcan, Vulcan 2, was working against it. And I kind of like that idea that it's a sort of clash of the Titans, a war against God, or a war between gods, if you will.
The character of Jason Dill reminds me of the character Ricky Stormgren from Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, where he's like the representative for Corellan when he comes down and solves all the world's problems, and he's just sort of like, well, what do I do? Like, I'm just a guy, and he's like the managing director of the entire planet, essentially. So he's like, okay, well, I'm the most important guy in the world. But he's still beholden to this machine. And it's illegal for him to withhold information from the machine, because the machine is pretty much shackled. It's just a box. Like the way we think of a 70s old punch card reader, that we just give it information and it outputs more. And that's exactly what Vulcan 2 was, I think. And that's how you sort of see these machines. They're supercomputers, and they're thinking so well, and they know what's going to happen. So Vulcan 2s will say something about the future, and you're like, oh, that's crazy. And that's one of the predicaments that Jason has to deal with. And the story sort of jumps between Jason, what he does in the start. There's a character called Arthur Pitt at the beginning where the action scene is. There's the what's his name? The director Barris, I think his name was. That's, I think, one of the main characters. And it's sort of this jumping between scenes as it comes up to I think there's 2 climaxes within the story, and how they deal with that. But it's that sense of paranoia. I think that because the pacing is so quick, I was first shocked at it because again, you read this, you're like, this world is too big. I need more time to flesh it out. I need to get the setting going, because when he starts traveling to and from Geneva, I'm like, okay, obviously we know why he's going there the first time, but so much happens during that first visit. You're like, holy crap, he got to visit all these other characters so quickly, and it all just connected like that. I was like, this is a bit too contrived. Just to see it when you take a step back and go, yeah, this was happening way too methodically. So I think if the story was longer, we would have had a time to appreciate at least some characterization, because these characters, they're flat. They're totally just straightforward. There's mystery involved, so yeah, one plays a detective here and there, but it's pretty much paranoia and wonder and fear. And some of the action scenes I can't really get behind, because we're talking about lasers, and those are and we're talking, I don't know, like a mining laser in the height of a pencil. It's extremely destructive. So you have to sort of say, okay, I'll just go with that and see how that war combat scenario might play out, and go with the themes of what may happen, whether you follow along with the rest of humanity, or you realize that there's a problem and you have to solve it, and what do you do? So this is, again, very bottom of the barrel for Philip K. Dick. He's not pulling on his other stories, where a lot of his previous books take the settings or themes of his other books and he combines them, like with Penultimate Truth was a big one. That was like a whole bunch of books in one. So this is his own thing. It's his own separate entity. And it kind of felt like a comic book, like a made-for-TV movie, but just sort of, again, stripped. There's a lot of things that it could have had that would have made the characters a lot more round. It would have made the conflict because Barris was just flipping out. He was like, what do I do? Do I go over here? Do I go over there? Who do I trust? And most of the people he's talking to are just as either vacant or I think the little girl was probably the best. I liked her the most because she was just so confident in what was going on. It's like, how do you know all this stuff? And everyone was looking at her like she was weird, but she knew what was going on. I thought having little girl characters or little boy characters in these sorts of dramas really just creeped me the hell out. But they work. She was very effective as a spokesperson for the themes of the story.
I agree, and I think she was very much sort of the Emperor Has No Clothes character. And to fill in for the listener, that character is the daughter, the precocious, plucky young daughter of the leader of the resistance movement, and she is a rather adorable character, very likable. Building on what you were saying about the flatness of the characters, about how short it is, how stock it seems, I actually agree with that. And one of the things you have to remember about a lot of these stories, now they are, part of the Philip K. Dick canon as standalone stories and that sort of thing. But one of the things to remember about him and a lot of other writers at the time was that this was an era when science fiction had not escaped from the pulp market. Most science fiction was published in Asimov's or Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, that kind of thing, and it would be published as a serial, longer forms would be published as a serialized novel and that kind of thing. And so you are dealing to a certain extent with pulp fiction, and that's one of the that was one of the things that Harlan Ellison, when he spearheaded the new wave of science fiction in the 60s and 70s, that's something he was pushing to get away from, and that's why he and Philip K. Dick were such great friends, because ultimately Philip K. Dick also wanted to write literary fiction, and so they both they were both instrumental in bringing that respect and that grandeur and prestige to science fiction as a genre, as a medium. But I think that's where that tonality comes from. This is certainly, like you said, it's certainly very bottom of the barrel in terms of his style, in terms of his flair. And I mentioned earlier that A Scanner Darkly is one of my favorite Philip K. Dick novels, and that's where we start to see the influence, or not start to, that's where we see on full display the influence of William S. Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and all the other beat writers, and his deep explorations of drugs and the psychedelic culture and all of that. And so I think it's a developmental transitional book for Philip K. Dick, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to focus on it. Because it is one that's not talked about very much. Thinking about the perspective, and you had mentioned this earlier. The computer that we're talking about, and it's important to keep in mind the kind of supercomputer we're talking about. This is an entity that fills several stories worth of an underground building with its core components, and that's something that's probably difficult for younger science fiction readers to relate to. Where now we have computers that are, the computer I'm recording this on right now is about 500 times more powerful than the computers that took us to the moon the first time. The level of technology has so surpassed it. But back when this book was written, a computer was an entity that filled an entire office complex. You would have to dedicate, and if you had a business that needed a computer, you would have to dedicate an entire floor of the building to it. And so computers were these vast sprawling monstrosities that, my dad was a computer programmer back in the day, and he recalled, like the vacuum tubes. You'd have to go in the morning and clean all of the bugs and gnats and spiders and everything out of the vacuum tubes, and this is just to get your standard computer up and running. And so that, with that in mind, I think it gives it a very different perspective. It gives it an interesting historical perspective as well, because there was this paranoia about computers because they literally seemed to dominate people's lives. The way the size of them, the scope of them, and the thing that's always so interesting to me in that regard is that we see it towards the end of the novel that the Vulcan 3 is essentially a cold, rational, purely intellectual machine designed to take in data, determine the best possible course of action, and convey that course of action to be followed. And because of that, what's interesting is everybody is looking for Vulcan to start becoming human, to start showing signs, to essentially pass the Turing test, if you will, and to start showing signs of artificial intelligence or genuine human intelligence. And Vulcan does, but it's in the context of paranoia. That paranoia, its ability to become paranoid and suspicious, that is what makes it human, ultimately. And that was, again, that's another ongoing theme in Philip K. Dick's writing, that paranoia is actually a sort of heightened clarity. I'm reminded there's a line from the movie Strange Days where one of the characters says, paranoid is just reality on a finer scale. And that line, I think, summarizes everything that Philip K. Dick has ever written.
Well, it's certainly not his greatest piece. We think of the top 10 science fiction authors like Clarke or Asimov. He probably doesn't even place, but it's because of these stories. Like when Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, that was pretty much the definitive question of what it means to be alive. Am I alive if I'm artificial? And the artificial theme here, artificial intelligence theme here in Vulcan's Hammer, is I guess you could. They were sort of speculating: is it paranoia, or is it just that the machine acting out its purpose with the additional orders to preserve its own existence? Because there was a division that happened between the directors when they come together. They say, okay, what do we do? Do we follow Dill because he's been withholding this information for a good reason? Or do we just follow our orders as we always have, as the entire system has been in place for? So they weren't questioning the objective observer as they should have been, or they weren't doing it well enough. So the problem still comes down to humanity deciding, well, we put our hands on this machine, how well are our safeguards? How well do our checks and balances work out? So the idea of AI was, I don't know, it wasn't as prevalent as other books. It wasn't as big as other stories. So it was just sort of, I would say, not tacked on, but it wasn't as developed as much. And that's why I wanted more. Because this could have been the next Brave New World. Like, the scope was that big. It just was a simpler story. And that's why I still think of it as a TV movie. It would be a great TV movie to watch on Sci-Fi. I loved it. I loved it in transit. I was reading it on the bus. A great story to read that way. It's action packed. There's lots of scenes with fighting, and I mean, it doesn't slow down, and it keeps going. Some of the characters, I thought Rachel was a little weird. Like, she was just weird and paranoid throughout the entire story. Even after the story is finished, she's still kind of okay. Like, Marion was still great. I mean, that was the one charming thing. I think the director Reynolds, I mean, that's exactly what he had to be the opponent. So it all sort of neatly worked out. But I think the only main characterization I got from Barris was at the start, when he realizes, I think it was Arthur Pitt, who gets killed. He's like, you know what? This is just a standard thing you fill out, a form you fill out, you tell the next of kin. He's like, you know what? I got to go there. Even though there's no policy, even though there's no standard to go and do so, he says, I got to go meet the person and talk to them, because he feels dispossessed in the society he's in. And he's a director. He's a guy in charge. So that is like, oh, okay, I get that. That really connects. And he goes out into the country, and he realizes that this country land, which is so devoid of technology, or devoid of the rest of the city, is so rustic and so like Victorian-esque and so colorful. And he was just impressed, like, who would spend all this money and time? And that was what Arthur Pitt, that's the character of Arthur Pitt, the lowly, what was he? He was just a cop, pretty much a beat cop, I think. And he was just doing his job, and he got attacked by the resistance movement. So little things like that I thought were interesting. But as a result of that, things got even more contrived. Rachel was, I think, just like the connections with Rachel was like, okay, how many people is she related to? Like, how did this work? And her past with her surgery and whatnot. That was like, okay, let's load it up. Let's keep going. So you begin to see nuances of what the society was like, and like I think I don't quite see the dystopia, but it is. Like, something's fishy going on here. So it was interesting, because when you read dystopian novels or utopian-esque versions of the future, you have this certain, okay, this is what happened, this is what caused people to do that. And in this story, it's like, yep, it's extremely simple. It's like, that's all that happened. There's a really big war. They put their faith in a machine, and that's it. There's no like magical drug like there is in Brave New World, although there is a very strange drug delivery system which really threw me off. I think it's Dill. He's sitting in his office. He puts a pill on his arm, and the pill like goes right through his clothing, right through his arm. I'm like, okay, that wasn't necessary. We didn't need to know that. that just sort of freaked me out. The technology is like, in terms of weapons, is really high, but that sort of physics-based distribution of drugs into your system was like, okay, you didn't need to go that far there, Dick. So.
I agree. I think, well, for me, it's always interesting to see those little things like that. But I always love when we throw in the little ideas like that. So, yeah, the drug delivery system was interesting to me, and it makes me think of, I think it's the Unteleported Man, where he's got he's got prison guards that shoot guns that shoot you up with a their weapons, their stun guns shoot you up with a fast acting, highly potent form of LSD, so you just collapse and trip into oblivion. And this would be this is certainly that idea. That was certainly one of the things that made Philip K. Dick very, very popular in the 60s and 70s, especially in the drug culture and that sort of thing, was this idea where psychedelics and hallucinatory experiences would be just so incorporated into our daily existence that it would become almost utilitarian.
Well, that sort of storytelling element works within the theme and within the setting, like the chrysalids, when they get to the end and there's that sticky web that just puts people to sleep and then kills them. Like, that's like, oh my god, what kind of society is that? Whereas in here, it's just like, well, Dylan's having a headache, so he's gonna magically get this pill into his arm through his shirt. I'm like, what? We didn't need to know that. So, what do you think of this story? I was on the fence, and I turned back and forth. I mean, looking back at it, I could see the flaws. I can see how it's definitely not his best work, and he didn't draw on his own creativity as much. But it was fun. It was quick. It's good sci-fi. It's in the time period where the classics were coming out, and I thought it was a good primer to get into the better stuff.
I would agree. Part of me, though, I really enjoyed it. And it was, if nothing else, it was just a good, fun adventure story with kind of some ideas, some implications about God. And a side note there, one thing I also occurred to me is that the Vulcan 3, the fact that it's constantly building new parts for itself and constantly expanding to the point where it's hundreds and hundreds of miles wide and down and all of that, kind of made me think about, like, that is kind of a metaphor for the rapid expansion of government, that bureaucracy becomes so redundant and self-replicating and that kind of thing. So I thought there was also a good message there, and I like that you could look at it as a metaphor for God or a metaphor for the government, because, as we kind of know, when it comes to people who are very authoritarian-minded, their perception of God and perception of the government are kind of more or less the same thing. So I would recommend it. I would actually recommend getting into the harder stuff first, though. Read A Scanner Darkly, read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Some of the heavier stuff first, in my opinion, would actually make this story a little more meaningful. I would worry that people who are not already in deep understanding and deep cognition of the Philip K. Dick universe and the way that he writes and his ideas and his perspective and that sort of thing, I think you're right that they might find this one a little bit shallow, and I would hate for that to be like someone's first impression of a writer, because the unique to writing, or unique to reading, I should say, is the time commitment involved in reading a book, which is going to be much longer than listening to a record or watching a movie. In those mediums, there's maybe an hour to 2 hours of an investment of time. And so you can say, well, if you didn't like that one, at least give this one a try. With books, this book, albeit it's a short one, the time commitment is going to make people, if they don't like it, it's going to make them weary of trying another one. But that said, I would definitely recommend it at some point in one's appreciation of Philip K. Dick.
I would say, well, two things. One, if you like dystopian stories, and this is sort of an under-the-radar one, you like sci-fi, you like novella formats or the short story format, definitely pick this up. But if you want a really good Philip K. Dick, he's done, The Penultimate Truth is excellent. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, of course, is is quintessential. So you're going to want to check those out first. But again, only if you like the format, because it's not considered a dystopian story by average readers. They see this, like, oh yeah, it's a short story, da da da. So you have to like the genre. If you do, definitely check it out.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to another. That brings us to the closing of another installment of Book Talk. Stefan, always a pleasure. And if you enjoyed this program, please consider becoming a donor to patreon.com/JordanOwen42. Your contribution will allow us to continue to bring you great content like this, pop culture and science fiction, fantasy, horror, pop culture, and current events analyzed and discussed from a libertarian standpoint. So thank you all very much for your time, and we look forward to bringing you another installment. Stefan, why don't you tell us a little bit about our next book?
Well, Roadside Picnic is a classic Russian story. It's by Arkady something. Well, it's actually by two brothers who were trying to get this book published for the longest time. Let me just look it up. Arkady and Boris Dugatsky. And this is going to be a very classic sci-fi Russian novel that I think I can say right now everyone should read, because it's that good.
Excellent. And I had actually seen the movie that was based on it some years ago, so I'm looking forward to reading the book.
And if you're a gamer guy, this is what Stalker was based on, very loosely. But this is how good this story is, that to have video games based off the ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a deeply influential novel. Roadside Picnic will be our next installment, so we look forward to bringing you that. And take care.